Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Biz Nidam, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this comics talk with Dr. José Alaniz. I'm the director of the UBC Pop Culture Cluster. So if you like this kind of programming, we would love for you to join our mailing list so you can hear more about the nerdy things that we like to talk about and present on across UBC. So before I begin, I wanted to acknowledge a few things. First, that this programming is taking place during Arts Multilingual Week, which is a week of programming that celebrates language diversity and instructed language learning at UBC Vancouver. Dr. Alaniz actually joined us to also speak about the Czech comic scene yesterday, which we served with donuts. We like to serve food when we learn about comics in all the programming I organized. And so I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that this programming is taking place during Arts Multilingual Week. And we have many other events taking place over the course of this week, including a global horror film festival. So if anybody is interested in international horror, we invite you to free popcorn and candy at the Norm every evening until the 30th. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're gathered in person on the traditional ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. And in order to make this land acknowledgement more meaningful and also draw your attention to work with comics that we're pursuing here on campus, since I don't think many of you spend a lot of time attending comics workshops, I wanted to mention one project that we're working on with the Homolko First Nation. This isn't with the Musqueam Nation here on campus. The traditional territories of the Homolko First Nation are in Vancouver Island, or off of Vancouver Island, Butte Inlet to be specific, off the coast of Campbell River. And this particular project connects with the work of Arts Multilingual Week because it was designed to be part of the Homolko First Nations Language Revitalization Project. We partnered with 3 Indigenous cartoonists to translate traditional knowledges into 3 short stories and then embedded the Homolko language in these comics. So I invite you to flip through the pages and think a little bit about how we can acknowledge language diversity by supporting Indigenous language revitalization through comic art. Now it's time for me to introduce our wonderful speaker today, who is actually a longtime friend of mine. Dr. José Alaniz is professor of the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures and the Department of Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Washington, Seattle. He has published monographs, Comics, Comic Art in Russia, Death, Disability, and the Superhero, and Resurrection, Comics in Post-Soviet Russia. As well as the book project that he's presenting to you today, Comics of the Anthropocene, which came out in 2025. He's also co-edited 2 essay collections, including Comics of the New Europe, Reflections and Intersections, which features part of my own research, which was an exciting opportunity for me, as well as Uncanny Bodies, Disability and Superhero Comics, which came out in 2019. He formerly chaired the executive committee of the International Comic Arts Forum and was a founding board member of the Comic Studies Society. His published comics and fiction also include The Phantom Zone and Other Stories, The Complete Moscow Calling, Puro Pinche True Fictions, Tales of Bart, a novel in 3 acts, and Moscow 93. So Dr. Alaniz not only writes about comics, he also produces comics. His current scholarly projects include a monograph on the representation of historical trauma in Czech graphic narrative, which connected to the work that we are doing in my comics and graphic novels class, which is SENS 308, and it explores comics and graphic novels in Central, Eastern, and Northern Europe. So I was grateful to have this opportunity to bring Jose or Dr. Alaniz to UBC Vancouver to share so much of the work that you're doing that I feel is connecting to what we do here at UBC Vancouver. So thank you so much, Jose, for joining us, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So thank you, Biz. Thank you, everyone, for the invitation. It is wonderful to be back in Vancouver. We're not too far away in Seattle, but it feels like a whole other country in more ways than one, unfortunately, at this time, politically in my country. But I'm always happy to come back and talk about comics, and you're doing such important work here, particularly with the First Nations project, that I think is really, really vital and important. And the other thing is that you know that when there's pizza, in the you've won the audience over already. The only danger is that by the time you get to your talk, they'll already be in a food coma, right? But hopefully, what I have to say will be engaging, and as you enjoy your lunch. So my book came out this year in the summer, and it is called Comics of the Anthropocene: Graphic Narrative at the End of Nature. It is the first full-length single-authored study to look at the question of comics representations of ecological crisis, whether it's climate change, whether it's pollution, whether it's microplastics, whether it's all sorts of other things. It all goes under this heading of the Anthropocene. And what I want to do today is talk a little bit about what the Anthropocene is. Some of you guys, I think, are in a class that's exploring the Anthropocene. Is that right? Raise your hands. Some of you guys. So some of you guys maybe are already, okay, a lot of you. So good. But you'll get my take on how comics approaches the Anthropocene and what tools it might bring to the table to better understand and communicate and maybe at some degree address the many, many issues pertaining to the Anthropocene. So you probably, in that case, don't need me to explain to you that the term Anthropocene comes from Greek. It is a term that was coined late in the last century by folks like Paul J. Crutzen, who is a climate scientist, an atmospheric chemist. Anthropos meaning human, and scene or kainos meaning recent or new, basically the age in which we're living in. Now, the Anthropocene, as some of you guys maybe might have discussed in your class, is not actually officially registered as the era that we're living in by the people who are responsible for that, the International Stratigraphy Commission. There have been attempts to get the Anthropocene registered in that way, but they haven't been able to make their case, right? Because we're dealing with geologists and people who are looking at much longer term periods of time than here. The Anthropocene, if you're going to take it at its face, is really a period that can't start any earlier than maybe 10,000 years ago. But most of the people who kind of argue for it are really only dating it back to maybe the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and even some people say not even until 1945. So for all of these reasons, it's been kind of rejected up to this point. That said, I don't think the Anthropocene is really a geological term anyway. It's really a term about how we feel right now, right? How we're dealing with the enormous changes that are visible throughout the world as a result of human interventions in the environment, right? Species loss, pollution, all of the things, climate change, all the things that I mentioned. I mean, these are real things that are happening that we're measuring, regardless of whether the term Anthropocene becomes something that is an unofficially accepted term by the people in charge. So anyway, so that's, again, maybe this is stuff that you guys have already discussed in your class. Be that as it may, the Anthropocene then is really a kind of challenge, really the biggest challenge. It's the only real thing that matters. Are we going to actually tackle this problem? Are we going to actually deal with the mess that we have made as a species? And not everybody is equally, of course, liable. Or are we just going to keep, in a sense, destroying the biosphere that we all depend on, right? And that will be really an answer that you guys, those of you who are in your 20s, those of you who are, in a sense, inheriting the planet that we are giving you, are going to have to figure out or not figure out, right? So we can look at someone like Elizabeth Kolbert, who is a longstanding journalist who's been exploring this question for many years. And she puts it this way. She says, it may seem impossible to imagine that a technologically advanced society could choose, in essence, to destroy itself. But that is what we are now in the process of doing, right? So it's really the only story that matters. If we don't have air to breathe or water to drink, nothing else can really happen, right? And if you ask me personally, nothing kind of pisses me off more than people say, well, we'll just go to Mars, or we'll just go to we'll go to Venus. We'll go to that's just ridiculous. That's not going to happen, right? And if it happens, it's not going to happen for you and me. It's going to happen for rich people, not for the vast majority, right? So that's not an answer, right? As much as maybe some folks maybe talk about it as if it were. So the question, right, for me and for a lot of folks who talk about the Anthropocene and deal with it, is how to represent this. How can you represent and make clear something that's happening all around you, right? That it's something that is obvious, but that is actually in many cases denied by a lot of folks as we go about living our very busy lives. This is a question of representation. And for me as a comic scholar, it's a question of visual, right? Visual verbal representation. So we can look, for example, not at comics, right, just yet, but let's look at maybe something like this, photography, right, by Nick Brunt, Lone Rangers holding the tusk of elephants killed at the hands of Mandon Amboseli from 2011. It's a beautiful photograph. It's classically kind of composed, wonderful kind of a production on that black and white image. But you see these men who are park rangers holding up all of these tusks of elephants that have been poached, that have been killed for their ivory, right? And so this to me is maybe one way to start getting at these questions of biodiversity, collapse, and the loss of species like big land animals such as elephants, right? But also, as you can see, Brandt is also making art out of it, right? This is a beautiful composition. It's horrifying to think of all the animals who lost their lives for this picture, right? But also, in a sense, it's bringing attention to it. And we are, after all, in a very image-saturated world. This is maybe the kind of image that might make you stop as you're scrolling on your phones on Instagram or something, because it's so beautiful. At the same time, it's very lovingly proportioned, and it's clearly a callback to a very classic European kind of version of what it means to be a human being during the humanist era of the Renaissance under someone like Leonardo da Vinci, right? Proportions of man. So he's playing off of that classicism, as well as just obviously discussing a very, very modern issue of the Anthropocene, which is biodiversity loss. I'm very moved by this painting by Tom Utek, who is from the Midwest United States, and who titles it Nin Mama Wawendan, more or less, which is an Ojibwe word for I am fond of it or I don't want to part with it. I don't know how well you can see it, but basically it represents a bunch of animals. It's a kind of departure. It's a kind of exodus image. It's all of these different species, mostly birds, but not just birds, that are all going away as we eliminate their habitat, as we develop wilderness, as we pollute the air, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're all basically bidding farewell, even though the painting itself is about not wanting them to go away, even as we make them go away, right? So it's those kinds of conflicts and paradoxes and emotional kinds of resonances that the Anthropocene is full of, as I will try to show you. I especially appreciate that you can zoom in and out of this painting. You can look at the overall kind of grand scheme, or you can just look at one little individual bird, right? Or piece of flora. Now, but again, it gets at this question, which I think is always laden with emotion, conflicted emotions in the Anthropocene in terms of how we kind of deal with it. Another way to represent it is in cinema. I'm not going to show you a clip of this, but this is a film, a documentary called Anthropocene, the Human Epoch. If you watch it, you'll see a lot of, this poster is actually very accurate for it. It just shows you a lot of blasted landscapes, quarries and mines and oil sands and burning kinds of rubber and all these other things that are kind of nightmarish and kind of hellish. And that's certainly one way, right? These are real places. There are regions of the world that are basically lost causes. They're so polluted and so basically mined that there's probably no way we're going to get them back in our own era. And so and that's kind of what this very somber approach kind of does. There's a bit of a danger with that, though, isn't there? Because, you know, people will maybe just want to check out. They don't want to be depressed for 2 hours watching a documentary about how horrible everything is. That's often a danger, it seems to me, that you see reflected. I'm frankly more fascinated in a different approach. This, for example, from 2012, Dirty Great Machines, which is not somber at all. Let me show you a clip from this, and you can kind of get a sense of what it's about. I'll just show you the beginning. What it's about. Here we go. And we have no sound. There it is.
The mightiest machines on the planet. Big, mean, and invincible. Battling Mother Earth, the modern world couldn't survive without them. In this episode, we come face to face with the largest land-based machines ever built. Bucket wheel excavators.
They're enormous machines. They have a great capacity.
Their only mission is to peel back the surface of the earth with each turn of their colossal parts.
You could compare this machine to an animal because it eats the rocks.
Whilst under the beating sun, surface miners scale new heights in scooping.
It's really hard work. You get really dirty.
It's time to get behind the wheels of some dirty great machines.
Okay. Dirty great machines. Yeah, right. So that is the opposite of somber, I think. It's very celebratory. It's like, whoa, look at that, right? Look at how exciting and how massive and how impressive, right, these things are that are scraping up the earth and sucking out its oil and all these other extractive processes. So there's no apology that's being made, right? They're getting the coal that's going to be firing up, whatever infrastructure that we all depend on, right? And that, to me, I think, is much more evocative in terms of what it means to live in the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is a modern problem. It's a problem because of how we live, of how dependent we are on these extractive resources, whether it's oil or natural gas or all these other things. That's what makes us dig into the earth like an animal, right, as they describe. So it's those kinds of things that I think are more resonant, I think, for most people, rather than, and it might be more memorable, ultimately, than the other approaches. This brings me to an important part of my study, which is derived from affect studies. Affect, part of what we call the affective turn, refers to the ways in which environmental factors like ideas, ideology, and the natural world influence bodies, as expressed through their emotions, physiological responses, and subjective states. Since the early 2000s, scholars in the humanities, like me, have taken up this critical approach to interpret literature, political speech, and other cultural expressions, which we call the affective turn. However, the use of affect theory to talk about the Anthropocene is a little bit more recent. And what I mean by this, right, affect is something that really happens to bodies. It is responses that bodies will have. They're usually nonverbal or pre-verbal. They're often about just the uncontrollability of those responses. So sometimes folks talk about affect as emotion, and certainly emotion is part of it, but that's not the only thing. You can't talk about the Anthropocene unless you're a robot. You can't talk about the Anthropocene without emotion, without the feelings that it brings up, feelings sometimes of loss, of guilt, or as we saw in the Dirty Great Machines, of excitement, right? Of gratitude for the incredible technologies that bring these wonders to us every day, like the wonders that we enjoy through our phones and through the technology that we're using here. So, as one of the mothers of affect theory puts it, Sarah Ahmed, I do not assume there is something called affect that stands apart or has autonomy, as if it corresponds to an object in the world, or even that there is something called affect that can be shared as an object of study. Instead, I would begin with the messiness of the experiential, the unfolding of bodies into worlds and the drama of contingency, how we are touched by what we are near. This is a very important aspect, I think, of affect for Ahmed and for others. It's not like affect is like necessarily something that is objectively quantifiable. It is part of one's subjective experience. It's part of your perceptions. It's part of, in a sense, how you're feeling that day, right? How you might have eaten something that affected your mood. All of these things, in a sense, which are unpredictable, right? They're all full of contingency, as she puts it. But they are all ways in which we react to the world and the environment going on around us, and to the world, and to representations of that world. What I want to share with you now is maybe one example that is also not comics. It is a poem. It's a poem called "Gentle Now, Don't Add to Heartache" by Juliana Spar, who was born and raised in Ohio. And it's a poem about a stream that she grew up with that used to flow by her house. So see again, let's think about how affect might be one way to try to understand this poem. We love the stream, and we were of the stream, And we couldn't help this love because we arrived at the bank of the stream and began breathing, and the stream was various and full of information, and it changed our bodies with its rotten, with its cold, with its clean, with its mucky, with fallen leaves, with its things that bite the edges of the skin, with its leaves, with its sand and dirt, with its pungent at its moments, with its dry and prickly, with its warmth, with its mushy and moist, with its hard, flat stones on the bottom, with its horizon of lines, gently rolling hills, with its darkness, with its dappled light, with its cicadas buzz, with trills of birds. This is where we learned love, and where we learned depth, and where we learned layers, and where we learned connections between layers. It was not all long lines of connection and utopia. It was a brackish stream, and it went through the field beside our house. But we let into our hearts the brackish part of it also, some of it knowingly. We let in soda cans, and we let in cigarette butts, and we let in pink tampon applicators, and we let in 6-pack of beer connectors, and we let in various other pieces of plastic that would travel through the stream, and some of it unknowingly. We let the runoff from agriculture, surface mines, forestry, home wastewater treatment systems, construction sites, urban yards, and roadways into our hearts. We let chloride, magnesium, sulfate, manganese, iron, nitrate, aluminum, suspended solids, zinc, phosphorus, fertilizers, animal waste, oil, grease, dioxins, heavy metals, and lead go through our skin and into our tissues. We were born at the beginning of these things, at the time of chemicals combining, at the time of stream runoff. These things were a part of us and would become more a part of us, but we did not know it yet. Still, we noticed enough to sing a lament, to sing and lament for whoever lost her elephant ear, lost her mountain mat tom, and whoever lost her butterfly, lost her hairlip sucker, and whoever lost her white cat's paw, lost her rabbit's foot, and whoever lost her monkey face, lost her speckled chub, and whoever lost her warty back, lost her ebony shell, and whoever lost her pirate perch, lost her Ohio pigtail, lost her club shell. That's an excerpt of the poem. And she's referring there towards the end. Some of you may know this. I had to look some of this stuff up. These are various different kinds of river species of fish and mussels that are very, very sensitive to changes in environment and to pollution. And she describes in the poem how the stream was just completely destroyed by the pollution, right? By all kinds of, not just from factories, but by people just dumping stuff in the stream. It is a story about this thing that was there for her, that taught her love, she says, right? This is where we learn love, but that was completely befouled and lost, right? This is the technical term for this, by the way, is solastalgia. It's related to nostalgia, but solastalgia is the disappearance of the places that are familiar to you, that you could never get back, right? It's when you go home and something has changed in your hometown or whatever, forever. So thinking about this poem, right? I find it a very, very powerful evocation of that feeling of loss. When you multiply the loss of a little stream by the house where you grew up, multiply that by 1 million, 10 million, and that's basically the Anthropocene, right? It is an age of human-induced transformation. It is one species taking it upon itself to just remake the planet, to the detriment of not only other species, which die in many cases, but also maybe to itself, right? As Colbert says, we're kind of destroying our own nest. So I think a poem like this, which is very, very personal, very, very much about a very particular place and a very particular memory of this place, is also extremely universal, it seems to me. And Spar, I think, is just brilliant at doing this. It is tragedy, I think, of the highest order. But of course, right, it's hardly the only example. There's many, many examples. Let me show you a much more famous example of a spill and of a polluted waterway. And this is 1969 in Santa Barbara, California. You have a very important or famous, influential, if that's the word, spill that happens where oil wells out in the water spilled over 3 billion gallons of crude into the ocean, an oil slick 35 miles long. And if you've ever been to Santa Barbara, it's a beautiful, beautiful coastline, beautiful part of California. Lots of oil on that day, of course, killing thousands of birds, fish, and sea mammals. It was actually hard to measure exactly how many, but there were a lot. And so you saw a lot of imagery in the late 60s like this. And it's really this event that we really start seeing the template being set for how to represent disasters environmental disasters on this scale, because this was a time when color televisions were first being put out onto the market in a mass way. So a lot of people for the first time saw even though I'm giving you black and white, sorry, pictures, but people for the first time were seeing footage like this in color. It was a similar effect, by the way, that was happening with the Vietnam War, because that was also the first time people were watching combat footage in color, and it really affected people's kind of, in a sense, perceptions of this event. Just that one technological change. But yeah, the idea of seeing birds, seals, other animals covered in oil, basically suffocating in it, drowning in it, becomes a pretty standard way to and so nowadays, to this day, when there's an oil spill, it's almost guaranteed you're going to see a bird covered in oil. It's just become a kind of cliche. But it really kind of goes back to that event in Santa Barbara, which was a catalyzing event because under the Nixon administration, which was in power at that time, they respond to things like this, partly because Nixon actually grew up not that far from Santa Barbara, so he actually was really keyed into this event. But also, I think in good faith, they wanted to respond to these kinds of problems and establish the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. Also, this really was a big catalytic event for the first Earth Day that happens in the United States in 1970 on April 22nd. It basically mobilizes over 20 million Americans, which was 1 in 10 people at that time in the States. Huge, huge rallies for the environment. And this leads to real concrete policies, right? Like the Clean Water Act in 72, the Endangered Species Act in 73, et cetera, a number of other agencies that are formed like the Environmental Protection Agency. As I said, a lot of these things, by the way, are under severe attack right now in the United States. A lot of rollbacks in environmental protection and stuff like that. But it goes back actually to that point and to a response to things like the Santa Barbara oil spill. So what I'm trying to say is that, again, right, there are ways to react and ways to maybe try to do things. It's never hopeless, so to speak. I think that's maybe the danger about discussions about the Anthropocene, that it triggers a kind of despair. But you know, it doesn't have to be that way. So this is a talk about comics. It just so happens that around that time in the 1970s, around the first Earth Day, we have cartoonist Walt Kelly, who had been working in comics since the 40s. He was a former Disney cartoonist, animator, and he'd been doing this comic strip, Pogo, for a couple of decades. He gets very involved with the environmental activist movement and starts putting imagery like this and storylines like this into his comic strip. And so again, right, it's an image of Pogo and his friends who are walking in Okefenokee Swamp where they live in Florida, but they come across a polluted landscape, like something that we would have seen with Juliana Spar, right? And so he says, Pogo, the beauty of the forest primeval gets me in the heart. It gets me in the feet, porcupine. It is hard walking on this stuff. Yep, son, we have met the enemy and he is us. That last phrase, we have met the enemy and he is us, became so popular and so resonant with folks in the environmentalist movement that it actually became a poster that Kemi does, and later on becomes an actual slogan for the environmentalist movement. And I would say that it's also a slogan for the Anthropocene, because the Anthropocene, as we see in the name, right, it's about the environment and about change. It's also about us, human beings, right? Anthropos is in the word. It's who is doing this to the environment. It's not the elephants or the dolphins. It is human beings. Not all human beings equally, but as a species, right? That's what we're doing. So comics, again, has been a part of this conversation itself for a long time. And so my study is sort of exploring, again, what uniquely comics can do and how these artists have uniquely approached the Anthropocene issue, even before the term Anthropocene was coined, like in 1970. That term didn't exist. So what I want to share with you guys now is the opening of the book, where I take, in the book, I try to take as much of a personal kind of approach as possible, because again, the Anthropocene is not just about something that's happening far away, it's happening in our own lives right now, right? It affects us personally. And so I talk a little bit about those episodes in my life where comics, in a sense, kind of opened my eyes to some of these questions, maybe not intentionally. So this is what I'm talking about here. Here's the opening of the book. 1982 saw an average global temperature of 0.25 degrees Celsius above historical patterns. Early that year, I picked up from the stands a copy of Fantastic Four, Volume 1, number 240 from March 1982. Now everybody knows how old I am. The latest issue of the Stories comic series published by Marvel. It contained Exodus, a 22-page epic written and drawn by fan favorite John Byrne, who had recently left Marvel's landmark series, The Uncanny X-Men. Though my 14-year-old self did not think of it in these terms at the time, Exodus was an eco-parable about climate refugees. So let me show you what Exodus is about. It's part of the Marvel universe. It's Fantastic Four. And so some of you may know that the Fantastic Four have some friends called the Inhumans who live in this hidden city in the Himalayas called Attilan. The Inhumans, as the name says, are not humans. They're another species. But what's going on in the issue is that they're all dying. They're basically all falling on their feet, and they ask the Fantastic Four for help. Fantastic Four comes and they figure out that you guys are all dying because the air is polluted. And the air is so polluted in the earth that it's even hitting you guys in the Himalayas, which has some of the cleanest air in the world, right? So they were, well, then what can we do? Like, hey, like, we got to breathe, like, we're going to die. But Reed Richards, the leader of the Fantastic Four, who is a genius, says, no, you know what we can do? We can move your city to the moon, right? And in those of you who know Marvel continuity know that there's a part of the moon in the Marvel universe that has air. It's called the blue area. So that's a little kind of a deep cut for some people. So they decide to basically cut the base of Attilan, the city, and they can do that because they're superheroes. They basically remove it from its foundations. And of course, they're superheroes, so they can levitate it. And so it levitates up into the sky and goes out into orbit and then on into outer space. So the whole story is about how they work together to basically leave Earth. And so you see them as they go down to the moon, and they go to the blue area, right, which happens to have the Watcher who lives next door. So he's going to have neighbors. And then they land on the moon and disembark. So they succeed. They have left the Earth, and now they're able to go on living in a space that is clean. This is why I call it an eco-parable about climate refugees. So later on in the book, after I've discussed all of it, I land here. Safely landed in the blue area, the refugees disembark. From every doorway in vast Attilan flows a flood of life, that's this page, as the Inhumans come forth to greet their new world. Along with its biblical references to Noah's Ark, the flood, and Exodus, meaning the book of Exodus in the Bible, this issue of Fantastic Four bears troubling implications. Reed Richards' determination of the Inhumans' destiny links it to a long history of white savior narratives, while Attilan's unceremonious landing onto the ruins of an ancient civilization brings up problematic notions of colonization and the extirpation of nature, since the colonizers never bothered to check whether anything is already living in the blue area, and if so, how it might be affected by a huge city-state dropping on top of it. Nonetheless, Byrne's narrative reflects Reagan-era concerns about air quality, environmental justice, and the vulnerable position of indigenous populations on a changing planet. In fact, a realization similar to one articulated by Bill McKibben later in the decade in The End of Nature, that humanity has left no inch of the planet untouched, unaffected, or in some way unpoisoned, drives the plot of Exodus. He says, I quote, "Now that we have changed the most basic forces around us, the noise of the chainsaw will always be in the woods. We have changed the atmosphere, and that will change the weather. The temperature and rainfall are no longer to be entirely the work of some separate, uncivilizable force, but instead, in part, a product of our habits, our economies, our ways of life. Even in the most remote wilderness, where the strictest laws forbid the felling of a single tree, the sound of that saw will be clear. A walk in the woods will be changed, tainted by its whine." So he's writing all of this, right, early in the 21st century, and it's fascinating to me just how appropriate it is for this kind of story. That a popular mass form like the mainstream superhero comic book would engage with such urgent global concerns, making them thinkable and actionable for young readers in the early 1980s, like me, is only part of why I chose Exodus to inaugurate a study on comics in and of the Anthropocene. Byrne's eco-parable was in fact continuing a trend in the genre, exploring environmentalist themes going back at least a decade, while, as I discuss in the next several pages, graphic narrative had long contended with issues of pollution, a changing natural environment, the effects on non-human life, and the ecological crisis writ large. Further, Exodus succinctly demonstrates the unique tools comic art brings to the challenge of depicting the Anthropocene. The immediate hurdle was how to represent the unrepresentable. So you can do that, right? In a superhero story, you can have fantastic kind of outcomes like this. But even as I was a kid, I get into this in the book, I was not really thinking about it in any of those terms. To me, it was just a cool story, right? It was a fascinating, colorful sci-fi epic. But even at that time, I remember thinking, they left Earth because they can't breathe the air. And that's great that they're able to, they have friends who can move them to the moon. But what about us? Like, what if we can't breathe the air? We can't go to the moon, really. We can't all leave. So, yeah, so even back then, I think there was the beginning of a stirring. So that, 40 years later, I'm putting this story into my book, right? Again, trying to personalize it as much as possible. Okay, so that's one way, right? So storylines, the content of the comics might be one way that we can approach the vastness of the Anthropocene in ways that are bite-sized, that are understandable, that are doable, right? Okay, but then there's other things that I want to consider in the book, and that is, what about comics just in terms of just how they function, the formal properties of comics, the aesthetics of comics, just how it is that they use words and pictures and compositions and particular techniques that are unique to the medium. How is it that that comics maybe in that way can also contribute to ways of thinking about the Anthropocene in more productive ways? So there's one thing that I call the mega image, and I coined this term because I couldn't find any. This is very common in comic studies. It's a very young field, and there's a lot of just stuff that we haven't quite named yet, or that we can't agree what the name is. But I'm basically, and I'll get into what I mean by mega image in a second, but I picked that image. But the one thing that I was worried about at the time and now is that people will mishear me and they'll think I'm saying MAGA image, but that's not what this is. It's mega image, meaning things that are big imagery. And so the reason I pick it is because there is a particular effect in cinema that is called the vertigo zoom, vertigo shot, or the dolly zoom. Some of you guys may already know where I'm going with this. But this is a very particular technique that you can only do in movies, can't do it in any other medium. And because basically it involves dollying in a camera and zooming out at the same time, or zooming in the camera and dollying back at the same time, which produces a kind of paradox effect, right? Which some people liken to getting seasick. It's very disorienting. So probably the most famous one of these, at least recently, in recent cinema, even though it's 50 years old, is from Jaws. So maybe you've probably even seen this. Let me show you what I mean by the vertigo zoom and why I think the vertigo zoom is an important kind of thing to consider when we're talking about the Anthropocene. Okay, so in cinema. So this is from Jaws. This is the scene where you've got, I'm sorry, but a little kid is going to get killed by a shark. That's just the way it happens in the movie. It's a little gory. But then it's the reaction of the character, Sheriff Brody, on the beach. That is the vertigo zoom. Okay, that was the vertigo zoom. I don't know if you noticed it. Sometimes people don't notice it, but sometimes people will watch a film with a vertigo zoom and they feel kind of somehow uncomfortable or they're dizzy or something. Sometimes it can work subliminally. But again, as you saw, they were dollying in and zooming back at the same time, which is kind of a contradiction, right? And of course, when you're zooming in, you're staying in one place, right? The camera doesn't move. But when you dolly in, the camera does move, which changes, of course, the perspective. And so you're kind of being given two different inputs, and your brain kind of has to make sense of them, and sometimes it can't. That's what it is. So clearly he's using it there to get at this feeling where you're shocked, right? So why is this important? Well, I'm responding here to a line in cinema studies that argues that the vertigo zoom is one way that we can start to articulate a sense of how cinema can focus draw our attention to moments of disorientation, moments of the uncanny, moments where we're not quite sure what we're seeing, which they then relate to this feeling of being in the Anthropocene. So all of the emotional contradictions and affect-driven responses that I was talking about. So basically, in a nutshell, the vertigo zoom for these scholars becomes a way in which cinema can kind of, in a sense, dredge up the feeling of being in the Anthropocene. All right. So I remember reading the article where they were talking about this and thinking, well, what do we have in comics? Right, Biz? That's what we're always doing is like, how come they get to have all the fun? How come it gets to be cinema people who can kind of come up with something that only happens in cinema and relate it to the Anthropocene? So, well, there's got to be something in comics that we can do. And that's where I arrived at the mega image, right? What is something that comics does just routinely as part of its own way of storytelling that is something that we can liken to something like a vertigo shot. So I look at images like this. The mega image, broadly speaking, is simply large imagery. You're reading a comic, you turn the page, there'll be many, many panels, you turn the page, and now there's one huge spread. This is what we call a double page spread, right? The book is, obviously I'm old, so I read stuff on paper. Nowadays, you might see it on a tablet or a phone. But either way, the image expands all of a sudden. And usually when you read these comics and you come to a page like this, it's always a lot of fun because it's almost like the world has just kind of blown up in your face. It's like going from an iPhone to IMAX, right? Very, very quickly. And so these are usually used in moments of dramatic, a climax or some kind of important moment. So in this case, from this 1940s Khazar comic, it's when there's a big stampede of elephants that he's trying to stop, right? And you can see all of a sudden just the environment takes center stage. That is what the mega image will often do. But actually, that's just the tip of the iceberg because there's a lot actually that is involved in the mega image. Mega images don't have to be all one image. They can actually be about the relationship with one image and smaller images like Dark Knight Returns that shows Superman being almost killed by a lightning bolt, right? But also, again, it's that moment of that freeze frame where we're all of a sudden being made aware of a moment of crisis and disorientation, and it's being done by the manipulation of size. This is, I think, one of my favorites, and this is another one, like the Fantastic Four, that I really retained from my youth. This already is when I was in college, but this image from Give Me Liberty, which is a futuristic story, basically in which the environment is almost gone, and they have to have army troops defend the last remaining rainforest against corporations like Fat Boy, which is a hamburger corporation. And so they want to destroy the rainforest so that they can put grazing cattle on there to raise beef, which is still the thing that we're doing now, right? That's why the rainforest often gets raised, is so that you can raise beef on it. But this image to me was just kind of says it all, right? It's all about this huge, lumbering, robotic, inhuman corporate logo that is kind of wandering around, toppling trees, killing soldiers in the name of a Happy Meal, right? In a sense, there's no better, I think, visual symbol for the Anthropocene than this. Our Happy Meals basically are killing the planet, basically, right? But who's going to stop eating Happy Meals? Who's going to stop eating hamburgers, right? Or is it even right to ask people to stop eating hamburgers? Here's another one. I'm going to go through a couple of these just to kind of just to give you a sense of the concept. The mega image, again, in a graphic novel like Concrete, Think Like a Mountain, he uses it here. Basically, you open the book and you see at this point in the story, they come across a clear cut. So it's basically a former forest that is now all stumps. And one of the people that they meet there, an environmentalist, she makes it her task to put like birth and death dates on all the trees. So 1811, 1990, 1798, 1996, et cetera, just as a way to kind of memorialize them, almost as if they were human victims. And so again, right, what you see here is how the mega image, the large image, mega image, I knew I was going to do it, is Freudian slip, is in a sense kind of exploding before your eyes and making you like more aware of it just through its bigness. Usually when we look at a large image like this as well, we tend to slow down because we want to look at all the different details. We want to immerse ourselves, right? What I like about this one is that it's got Concrete and his friend. Concrete is like the big lumbering dude in the back there, and his friends in the back, and they're almost like giants. They're they seem to be kind of standing on top or above this clear cut, and then you see them down here on the bottom on the second page in a more kind of normal scale, right? So they're kind of both here and there. And then also that eagle, right? You can see here in its from this other angle, which is, you could read it that eagle over there on the top left. So there's all sorts of playing with scale here that the mega image makes possible. Mega imagery, I think, can be very, very flexible, and it doesn't even have to be big, but it's all about giving you a sense of the immersive quality. And usually in the service, I would argue, of trying to put you into a particular kind of mood or world. I'm just picking the ones that deal with nature here. This is Frank King's Gasoline Alley, a very famous seminal comic strip from the early 20th century. And part of what the comic strip kind of was doing was very important, was that it was telling the story in real time. So that 1 year in the comic strip equaled 1 year in real life. So that it starts off with a little baby called Skizix, right, that the main character adopts. But already after a year, the baby's a year old, and after 20 years, the baby's 20, and so it kind of follows his story. So it was very much about not creating that kind of more artificial reality per se, but actually, or you know, where Bart Simpson is still 8 years old, even like after 30 years or something, but actually kind of giving you a real lived quality of these characters developing almost like real people. But one of the things that he would also do is he would repeat things. So every fall, right, he and Skizix would go, Walt is the father's name, Walt and Skizix would go on this walk to see the changing of the leaves. And that's what's going on here, right there. So this becomes something that readers would look forward to. They knew it was going to happen again. It was a kind of a cyclical thing. And I think that also puts us into this state of a kind of mega image a quality, it seems to me, the immersive part of it. Or something in a sense, the opposite of that would be John Porcellino's Diary of a Mosquito Abatement Man, a more recent work, which is basically about how he had a job back in the 90s that was basically just to spew poison into the air to kill mosquitoes, and how at one point he goes into this factory setting and just describes how nightmarish and dystopian everything looks, because there's no trees. It's all just an industrial kind of hellscape. But again, right, Porcellino, if you know his work, he tends to make very, very small kind of zine-like little mini comics that tend to be very, very kind of small scale, like smallness, I think, is a lot of what he does. But it's in this moment where he encounters this huge industrial scape that he's spewing poison into. That's when he goes bigger. He uses bigger panels, right? So I think for Porcellino, these are really big images. And I think, again, the mega image functions in that subjective way, just like the Anthropocene itself is a subjective state. Final example, I think, almost final example, is Peter Cooper's graphic novel Ruins, part of which is told from the point of view of a butterfly. It's actually not quite clear. It's not the same butterfly, but it's about the migration of butterflies from the Northeast down to Mexico to where they're going to spawn. But every time we get to the butterflies, we have a mega image. We have a large splash page, a single image. And so we follow the butterfly's journey down to, in this case, what looks like Florida, somewhere in the South, people picking crops. Here, Katrina, or New Orleans after Katrina, as you can see here. Or here, through a kind of fanciful representation of the butterfly's the way that it uses the magnetic fields of the Earth to kind of guide itself, right? So again, right, all of it being done in these larger images. I really think this is how comics, I think, wants to kind of punctuate and stamp this almost like an otherworldly sense, right? To get you to contemplate in ways I think we can relate to the Anthropocene. Maybe the best example, certainly recently and of this century, would be Richard Maguire's graphic novel Here, which is all mega images. It's basically one two-page spread after another. If you know this work, anybody read this? A few people besides the obvious suspects. Well, it's a work that only takes place in one place. It is set in a corner of the house where Maguire grew up, so you never leave there. It's always the same place. What he changes, though, is the time period. So each one of those panels, as you can see, 1950, 1968, 1843, these are all different time periods in that place. So you're always getting this haunting, almost kind of sense of what has happened there in the past or what will happen there in the future, because the one that I picked for you here, 2111, hasn't happened yet from our perspective, but it shows flooding coming through. So the implication is climate change, right? So, and again, he uses mega images throughout the whole work to get at this point. Here's another one that I like. He goes all the way back to 10,000 BC. So at some point in 10,000 BCE, there was a bison who was just kind of sitting there in his corner, of course, before it was ever a corner, before his house was built, right? So again, one of the things that is also useful in this work is to get at another rather difficult concept in the Anthropocene, which is deep time. The idea that these changes that are going on, they happen gradually. Very often they started before we were born, right? And that we're feeling these effects now. So it's very hard to, in a sense, address these things because psychologically humans in general are not really wired that way. We're kind of more wired to respond to immediate threats. A tiger chasing us, right? We know exactly what to do in that situation. But if it's something that takes decades to develop, if it's something that takes, you know, a long time that for the carbon to build up in the atmosphere, the emissions and everything, that's a lot harder because we don't see the effects or we don't think we see the effects. We're more insulated from the effects, right? But if we live in a low-lying area, maybe we're not, right? So I think a graphic novel like this can be very useful to get at that concept of deep time. And it does it through mega images. Okay, there's one other concept that I think is also very important, and that gets, again, at something that only comics can do. And this is coming from a philosopher named Timothy Morton at the University of Houston, who is basically considered the philosopher of the Anthropocene, who has been writing about these for quite a while. And so Morton, who uses they, them pronouns, talks about what it means to declare an ecological object, what that idea is. And this is from the book. This is where he says, Timothy Morton's philosophical program is in large measure a repudiation of the understanding of nature inherited from the Romantics, one premised on a subject-object relationship that sees the environment as separate, grand, pristine, or sublime. In place of such thinking, they posit the ecological, a radical mesh-like embrace of otherness coexisting, co-equal, and overlapping with the self. There is no me and nature. Me and nature are the same thing. We're coextensive with each other, right? Like the bacteria in our microbiome, the non-human genetic material in our DNA, the microplastics ingested with our meals, or the pollution swirling in our air that we breathe in, we are already, in a real sense, coextensive with nature, while nature is itself entirely suffused with the human, along with everything else. That's what the Anthropocene means, right? Nature is full of us. In this understanding, even man-made objects like styrofoam and plutonium are ecological. As Morton puts it, the very idea of nature, which so many hold dear, will have to wither away in an ecological state of human society. Morton is very skeptical of the idea that nature is somewhere in some beautiful national park or some beautiful rainforest, something like that. Nature is right here. This is nature. We are nature, right? This is, I think, part of the problem is that sometimes this binary way of thinking might lead us astray. Much more useful, Morton says, is to think of ourselves as already, in a sense, overlapping with the environment, and to think of ourselves as ecological objects. For him in art, right, to start thinking about hybridity and mixedness and the notion of one thing blurring into another, right? Another term for this is transcorporealism. If you can see art that's kind of doing that, just as its usual order of business, he calls that kind of art ecological. And that's what I mean, because when I start thinking, well, then, gosh, that means all of comics, in a sense, is ecological, because it's always doing that. Comics is a hybrid art. It is verbal and visual. It's using text and images all the time, right? And so I picked some examples just to get at this idea. You know, from the mainstream, there's nothing more mainstream than X-Men in the 1980s. It was the most successful series at the time, right? Kind of legendary. But look at this, right? From the beginning of number 135, that's the title, right, of the story, Dark Phoenix. But it's also, right, a very stylized use of language to give you the sense of an explosion, right? It's both words and image. This is what we call, or this is what Morton calls a kind of ecological art, where it's never just one thing or the other. It's kind of all mixed together. And you can't understand comics without this kind of stuff, because comics does this all the time. Or something like this from Batman, also, you might have heard of, right? From DC, where you can have the panels both be obviously separate kind of moments in that story, but they're also part of a grander composition. This is a pretty standard way in which we teach comics, by the way, is that when you look at a page, you're looking at particular units of time that are separated, but you're also, in a sense, getting a very real view of all of the art, of all of those moments together, right? And so all that J.H. Williams III is doing here in the art is kind of creating a Batman logo out of that, right? So comics in that respect are very ecological, whether they're dealing with environmental questions or not, right? I hope I've made that case. But then, of course, comics that are kind of to some extent dealing with environment, I think, are doubly ecological in that regard. But I mean, something like this from 2004 from Wild Girl, you know, the ways in which this is such a wonderful mega image, because it is all about getting a sense of different temporalities. Those deer, the trees, the moon, the landscape, they all exist basically as one picture, right? Notice how the deer are able to cross the gutter here. So clearly they have a way of, they're living in a different time space from the human or human-like figures like the wood spirit, right? And the main character there. They could only exist in each individual panel, because those are individual moments that it's laying out for you, right? And so again, we're getting, in a sense, multiple notions of time and representations of an action here. Those deer and the landscape, in a sense, live in their own world, right? Where the more mobile figures just kind of occupy space. And comics, I think, can make that very, very evident through its unique techniques, right? To kind of expand it a little bit, it takes maybe more experimental or avant-garde examples like Hugh Swart's Torn Together, which is kind of a classic in experimental comics. The story is kind of about various forms of ripping and tearing things, but then as part of the comic, he literally just tore a corner. So when you got this comic, it would actually have part of it ripped out, right? So again, the ripping theme is itself coextensive with a real ripped comic in real life, right? Which again, in a more conventional setting, this would be ruining the comic. This is a terrible thing to do, but actually this is part of the message of this story. So again, this is, I think, another example of ecological. Composition, very important, right? Composition is key to the way that comics operates. Every page is both single separate moments in each panel, but they're also, in a sense, all those moments together. And you can't really make sense of a page like this, right, without seeing a face there. The face is not in the individual panels, it is in all the panels together at the same time, right? And so I think comics, there are millions of examples of stuff like this where I think we can see that happening all the time. I think comics, frankly, even though Morton doesn't really talk about them that much, I think comics are the ecological objects par excellence. Okay, so I'll just kind of start winding down now, but we can certainly see a lot of this even in just stuff that's maybe a little bit more conventional, like Robert Crumb's Short History of America, where he shows you at the top left what we tend to think of as a pristine environment. Interestingly, this is pristine environment, has no native peoples. Of course, they would have been there, but they're missing, as often happens with these erasures of history. Anyway, it's a pristine, quote unquote, setting, and then over the course of 12 panels, you wind up at the bottom right with a very urban, very developed kind of place, and all the trees basically gone, right? And again, there's nothing, I think, more evocative of the Anthropocene than this, because of course that is our lives, right? That final panel. But he's showing you how we got here. And when you take a step back, all you got to do is look at the whole thing together, and you can see those moments. You can see that it's a process, right? Rather than just something that just happened, right? And so even if you're born in that 12 panel, like I imagine a lot of you guys are, right? You know, you can see in a sense how we got here. Very important, right? So that's I think part of what comics can do, probably better than any other medium, to give us a sense of that, again, of that deep time question. A German example, because Dr. Biz kind of is in the Germany business. But this is by Jens Harder, Alfred Deutsch. Fantastic work. Fortunately, it's translated into English. But I am just enthralled with this because it's basically a history of the universe from the Big Bang to the present. And this first volume, Alpha, is from the very Big Bang. It has no humans at all. It's got a lot of dinosaurs and all sorts of other things, but we don't actually get to humans in this volume. We get to proto-humans. But what he does in mega page after mega image after mega image, compositions like this, is not only just kind of give you the science, it's the greatest science book I think ever, science comic ever done, but to give you all of this information, massively researched. But he also, of course, gives you a kind of sense of the mythic, because ancient peoples didn't have theoretical physics, so to speak, but they did have creation myths. They did have all sorts of ways in which they were understanding who they were, where they came from, how things developed. And it's not that they were necessarily wrong, right? And so he kind of incorporates a lot of that sort of imagery in there. Fascinating kind of material, as well as a lot of popular culture, including in the right panel there at the top, the Unifactor, which is where Frank lives, Frank is the character by Jim Woodring from his Frank comics. Jim Woodring is Seattle's most famous artist, comics artist. Or down here, Godzilla and King Kong, as you can see here, right? Of course, those are not meant to be scientific statements. They're meant to be more about how popular culture kind of takes these things and does its own thing with them. And when we're watching a Godzilla movie, in a sense, we're watching something that tells us about dinosaurs going back a long way, right? Et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so again, I think this kind of hybridity, it's popular, it's science, it's words, it's image, it's composition, it's all of these things kind of at the same time, is basically what defines an ecological object for Morton and for the comics medium. Okay, so I will finish up, I think, fairly quickly there, because I do spend a lot of time in the book on one particular series called the Puma Blues. Originally in the 1980s, it was kind of a cult comic series. You kind of had to know where to find it. I'm lucky that I stumbled upon it back then. It was dropped, it was canceled. It was actually canceled a couple of times by different publishers. But it was then revived in 2015 as a book, and it was completed, the story. But it's basically really a remarkable document about the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, before that term was actually really popular or understood, and a pretty somber and harrowing and pretty nightmarish dystopia about things like nuclear testing and the ways in which nuclear energy is again part of the Anthropocene. It both supplies energy that we all live on and power our devices. It also creates horrible waste that will take thousands and thousands and thousands of years to decompose. And it's radioactive. It's also led to things like the American Southwest being the most bombed part and irradiated part of the world, right? So it's all of these kinds of things that it's sort of dwelling on. And of course, this is a Cold War work at the time, but also, right, it also is a very, very ecological piece in the sense that it's always kind of referencing other things. There's a lot of mixing here of high and low, whether it is in the top panel, that hand directly kind of being quoting of all people, Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam, one of our most famous works of Western painting, right? Or in the bottom panel, it is quoting Pogo, the very figure that we mentioned earlier, right, from around the first Earth Day. So it's very much about, in a sense, kind of plugging itself into all of these other discourses and visual registers in order to kind of make sense of it. I have longer readings of these pages, but I realize that I've been talking for a while, so I'll try to wrap up. The last thing that I will say is that I wanted to have a shout out here for a Canadian. The astronaut Chris Hadfield also appears in Puma Blues singing a version of David Bowie's Space Oddity, which he really did. You can see it on YouTube when he was up in the space station. But also that's being blended with the cover of Diamond Dog's album by Bowie from 1974, with famous cover of him as a dog man, itself another image of hybridity. But just to expand this, I want to show this is a mega image, because you open the book and it's a double page spread, which shows you Bowie and Hadfield, right, kind of together, but also shows you Bowie at different stages. The top left is Bowie when he was about almost dead. The book comes out right around the time that Bowie died in 2016. He was still alive when they made this, but he was ill. But then notice how, again, you don't ever get just one Bowie, and that makes a lot of sense because David Bowie, right, his whole career was about remaking his personas. There was never just one Bowie. There was a lot of them. And so I think he's the perfect kind of choice to kind of embody this idea of instability, of disorientation, of multiplicity, of hybridity, and all sorts of other things. But they're all, of course, talking about climate change in this passage. So that's the kind of stuff that I try to get into in the book, the ways that comics can inform and challenge and revitalize our discussions and hopefully our understandings of the Anthropocene, because at the end of the day, we are the Anthropocene. It is our planet, and it is kind of up to us. So I'll leave it at there. Thank you.